6 months after the end of what became known as the Silent War, the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted when the USS Horizon first encountered the Vazirith, and humanity found itself in a position it had never sought, but could not avoid, which was that of a major power in galactic affairs. The Galactic Council formally invited humanity to join as a full member, and sent Ambassador Chen Wei to represent Earth's interests. And she was a career diplomat who had spent 30 years preparing for the day when humanity would take its place. Among the stars, though, she had imagined it would come through friendship rather than force. Chen Wei arrived at the council chambers, which were located on a neutral space station, orbiting a star system that belonged to no single species, and she was greeted with a respect that bordered on fear as representatives from 12 different civilizations welcomed humanity into their organization. The first order of business was establishing protocols for first contact between species, because the disaster with the Vazirith had demonstrated the need for clear rules about how civilizations should interact when they first meet, and humanity insisted on contributing to these protocols based on their painful experience. The protocols that emerged were comprehensive and included requirements for peaceful initial communication and prohibitions on territorial claims based solely on prior presence, and protections for pre-spacefaring civilizations and consequences for species that violated the rights of others. Supreme Prelate Vorath had been removed from power by his own people, who recognized that his leadership had nearly destroyed their civilization, and he now lived in exile on a remote Vazirith colony where he was forbidden from participating in public affairs and spent his days writing memoirs that no one wanted to read. The new Vazirith government was led by a council of reformers who were determined to transform their society from a hierarchical empire into a more egalitarian confederation, and the process was difficult and painful but necessary if they wanted to rebuild their reputation and economy. Julie Morrison returned to Earth after 18 months in space and found that she had become something of a reluctant hero to some people and a symbol of military aggression to others, and she avoided public appearances because she did not want to be celebrated for actions that had been necessary but not praiseworthy. She met with Secretary Bennett in a private office in Geneva, and they discussed the future of human expansion and exploration, and Bennett admitted that the government was struggling to balance the public's desire for security with the principles of peaceful exploration that had guided the Frontier Initiative. Julie argued that humanity needed to remember why they had gone to the stars in the first place, which was not to conquer or dominate, but to learn and grow and connect with other forms of life, and that losing sight of that mission would mean the Vazirith had succeeded in changing humanity into something worse. Bennett agreed in principle, but noted that the reality was that other species now viewed humanity as a military power first, and explorers second, and that perception would shape future interactions, whether humans liked it or not, and they needed to be realistic about the situation. Captain Foster took the Horizon on a new mission to explore systems in the opposite direction from Vazirith space, and his crew was carefully selected to include diplomats and scientists and cultural specialists, because the goal was to demonstrate that humanity was still interested in peaceful contact despite what had happened. The Horizon encountered 3 new species in the following year, and each contact was handled with extreme care and patience and transparency, and Foster made sure that every communication emphasized humanity's preference for friendship over force, and slowly the reputation began to shift. Dr. Monroe published a series of papers analyzing the differences between human and Vazirith approaches to technology and culture, and her work became required reading at universities across human space, because it helped people understand that conflict was not inevitable between different species but resulted from specific choices and assumptions. The hostages who had survived the crisis formed a support group and met regularly to discuss their experiences and their feelings about the war that had been fought to rescue them, and Martin Cruz became a spokesperson for the group and argued that the best way to honor what happened was to ensure it never happened again. Amy Watson wrote a book about her experiences that became a bestseller on Earth and Mars, and she used the platform to advocate for better education about alien cultures and psychology because she believed that understanding was the key to preventing future conflicts. General Cross retired from active service and took a position teaching military strategy at the Academy, where he emphasized to his students that the greatest victories were the wars that were never fought, and that true strength was having the capability for violence but choosing restraint. Dr. Yang continued his weapons research, but also began working on defensive technologies and communication systems that could help prevent misunderstandings between species, and he believed that humanity's role should be developing tools for peace rather than instruments of war. Admiral Porter commanded the defense forces that protected human space, and she maintained a fleet that was powerful enough to deter aggression, but deployed in ways that emphasized protection rather than threat. And she worked closely with other species to coordinate responses to pirates and other common dangers. The trials of Kralith and the other Vazirith war criminals concluded with sentences that ranged from lengthy imprisonment to exile, and the verdicts were accepted by most observers as fair and appropriate, though some humans thought they were too lenient, and some Vazirith thought they were too harsh. Kralith spent his imprisonment writing letters to Julie Morrison, in which he tried to explain his actions and justify his beliefs. But she never responded because she did not want to engage with someone who showed no genuine remorse, and she believed that some conversations were not worth having. Director Lucas Grant was appointed to lead the newly formed Galactic Affairs Office, which was responsible for coordinating humanity's interactions with other species and managing diplomatic relations and intelligence gathering, and he assembled a team of experts from multiple disciplines. The office's first major project was creating a comprehensive database of known alien species, including their cultures and technologies and political systems and communication styles, and the goal was to ensure that humanity never again entered a first contact situation unprepared. Chen Wei negotiated humanity's first trade agreements with other species and discovered that human art and music and literature were in high demand across the galaxy because they offered perspectives that were genuinely unique, and other civilizations were fascinated by human creativity. The economic benefits of galactic trade began to transform life on Earth and Mars and the colonies as new technologies and ideas and resources flowed into human space, and the standard of living improved dramatically, though some worried about becoming dependent on alien systems. The Vazirith slowly rebuilt their economy and military, though under close observation from both human and galactic council monitors, and the new generation of Vazirith leaders emphasized cooperation rather than domination, and gradually they began to earn trust. 5 years after the Silent War, a Vazirith delegation visited Earth for the first time, and they came with gifts and apologies and proposals for joint scientific ventures, and Julie Morrison was asked to meet with them, and she agreed, though she did not know what she would say. The meeting was private, and the Vazirith representatives were young people who had not been involved in the war, but felt the weight of their species' actions, and they asked Julie what they could do to make amends for what their predecessors had done. Julie thought about this question for a long time before answering, and finally she told them that the past could not be changed, but the future could be shaped, and that the best way to honor those who had died was to build a galaxy where such tragedies became impossible. The Vazirith agreed and proposed a joint memorial project that would commemorate the victims of the war and serve as an educational center about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of communication, and Julie supported the project because she believed in the power of remembrance. The memorial was built on a moon in neutral space and included exhibits from both human and Vazirith perspectives, and visitors from dozens of species came to learn about the war and its lessons, and slowly it became a symbol of how conflict could be transformed into understanding. Julie retired from military service at the age of 58 and took a position teaching at the Diplomatic Academy, where she trained the next generation of explorers and first contact specialists. And she always began her courses with the same warning, which was that the greatest danger in meeting new species was assuming you understood them. She told her students about the Vazirith and about how both sides had made mistakes and how close humanity had come to becoming the very thing they fought against, and she emphasized that maintaining humanity's values in the face of threat was harder, but more important than winning any battle. Foster continued exploring and made first contact with 17 new species over his career, and he became known throughout the galaxy as someone who could be trusted to approach new. The 72 hours that followed the cessation of active combat were perhaps more terrifying for the Vazirith than the battle itself had been, because human forces maintained complete silence while occupying positions throughout Vazirith space. and their ships hung in orbit over major worlds like swords waiting to fall. Admiral Porter established a perimeter around the Vazirith capital world, and her fleet maintained perfect formation while her crews went about their duties with mechanical precision, and no one spoke to the aliens who sent increasingly desperate messages begging for communication or negotiation or any sign that humanity was willing to talk. The psychological impact of the silence was devastating, because the Vazirith had built their entire society on the principle of hierarchy and communication, where the strong told the weak what to do, and the weak obeyed. But now the strong were silent, and the weak did not know what was expected of them or what would happen next. Kralith had been stripped of his rank and title by Vorath in a desperate attempt to show humanity that the collective was willing to punish those responsible for the hostage crisis. But the humans showed no interest in Vazirith internal politics, and their ships maintained their positions without responding to any overtures. Supreme Prelate Vorath found himself in an impossible situation, because surrendering to the humans would mean admitting that everything he had taught his people about Vazirith supremacy was a lie, but continuing to resist would result in the complete destruction of his civilization, and neither option was acceptable. Captain Gregory Shaw commanded the occupation force over one of the Vazirith's major industrial worlds, and he maintained strict orders that his people were not to engage with the local population except through automated systems, and the result was that supply deliveries and infrastructure maintenance continued, but without a single word being spoken between humans and aliens. The Vazirith civilians found this silence more disturbing than threats would have been, because at least threats could be understood and negotiated, but silence left them guessing and wondering and imagining all the terrible things that might happen. And human psychology understood that fear of the unknown was often worse than fear of the known. Colonel Grant rotated his special forces teams through the occupied zones and ensured that human military presence was visible and professional and completely unapproachable. And when Vazirith officials tried to initiate conversations, they were met with blank stares and automated responses directing them to wait for further instructions. The hostages who had been rescued were returned to Earth and Mars, where they received medical treatment and psychological counseling. And Martin Cruz gave interviews describing his captivity and rescue, but what interested people most was his description of the Vazirith guards' faces when the human soldiers arrived, because he said they had looked confused at first and then terrified as they realized their mistake. Amy Watson returned to teaching, but found that her students were more interested in hearing about the war than about science. And she tried to explain that what happened was not something to celebrate, because violence was always a failure of better options, but sometimes it was necessary to stop greater violence, and the trick was knowing the difference. Other alien civilizations had been watching the conflict with great interest, because they had also misjudged humanity and assumed that the diplomatic species was weak, and now they scrambled to open communication channels and offer friendship and trade agreements and anything else that might keep them on humanity's good side. The Galactic Council was a loose confederation of 12 species that had maintained peace through mutual cooperation and trade for over 5 centuries, and they sent urgent messages to Earth requesting a meeting to discuss humanity's application for membership, which had been pending for years but suddenly became a priority. Secretary Bennett reviewed intelligence reports showing that 6 different alien civilizations had revised their military doctrines in the past week to account for human capabilities, and 3 had begun peace initiatives with neighbors they had been in conflict with because no one wanted to be the next species that humanity decided to educate about the consequences of aggression. On Earth, the public reaction was mixed because some people celebrated the victory and called for continued military expansion, while others worried that humanity had revealed too much about its capabilities and made itself a target for other species, who might see them as a threat rather than a potential friend. General Cross understood both perspectives, but his focus was on the immediate situation, which was that humanity now occupied 12 Vazirith star systems and needed to decide what to do with them, because maintaining a military occupation indefinitely was not practical or desirable, but withdrawing too soon might embolden the Vazirith to return to their old ways. Dr. Yang and his team analyzed captured Vazirith technology and found that in some areas it was indeed more advanced than human equivalents, but in other areas humanity had leaped ahead through different approaches to similar problems, and the conclusion was that no civilization had a monopoly on innovation or intelligence. Julie Morrison was promoted to admiral, and given command of the occupation forces, which was both an honor and a burden, because she had to balance the need to maintain security with the desire to return to peaceful relations, and she spent long hours trying to determine how to accomplish both goals. Commander Foster was promoted to captain and given command of the Horizon, which would continue its exploration mission once the current crisis was resolved, and he met with Julie to discuss their concerns about whether humanity could return to being explorers after proving themselves to be such effective warriors. The turning point came on the 7th day after the ceasefire, when Supreme Prelate Vorath made a public address to his people that was also broadcast to human forces, and in it he formally acknowledged that the Vazirith Collective had committed grave crimes against humanity, and that their assumptions about human weakness had been catastrophically wrong. Vorath's address was remarkable because it represented a complete reversal of everything he had said before, and he admitted that the Vazirith had allowed arrogance to blind them to the truth that strength came in many forms, and that a species that chose diplomacy was not necessarily weak but might simply prefer peace to war. The address concluded with a formal request for negotiations and a promise that the Vazirith would accept whatever terms humanity deemed appropriate because they recognized that they had no leverage and no right to demand anything after what they had done. Julie forwarded the address to Earth Command along with her assessment that the Vazirith surrender was genuine and that continued occupation was achieving its purpose of demonstrating human resolve, but that opening negotiations would serve humanity's long-term interests better than extended military presence. Earth Command agreed and authorized Julie to begin preliminary talks while a full diplomatic team was assembled and sent from Earth, and the decision was made that humanity would finally break its silence, but would do so on its own terms and in its own time. The first communication from humanity came exactly 8 days after the ceasefire, and it consisted of a simple message delivered by Julie Morrison in a recorded transmission that was broadcast across all Vazirith space, and in it she stated that humanity was willing to discuss terms for ending the occupation and establishing peaceful relations, but that certain conditions would need to be met first. The conditions were presented as non-negotiable and included full accountability for those responsible for the hostage crisis and the murders that had occurred, and complete transparency regarding Vazirith military capabilities and intentions, and acceptance of human presence in territories that the Vazirith had previously claimed as exclusive. Additionally, humanity demanded that the Vazirith agree to protocols for first contact that would prevent similar incidents with other species, and that they participate in the formation of a galactic organization dedicated to peaceful conflict resolution and protection of sentient rights. Vorath accepted every condition without argument because he understood that the alternative was continued occupation or worse, and that humanity was offering a path forward that allowed the Vazirith to survive as a civilization even if it meant accepting a diminished status in the region. The negotiations proceeded quickly once they began because the Vazirith were motivated to cooperate, and humanity had clear objectives that were focused on preventing future conflicts rather than punishing past actions beyond what was necessary for justice. Kralith was arrested along with 17 other Vazirith officials who had been directly involved in the hostage crisis and torture, and they would face trial under a new legal framework that combined human and Vazirith law and was overseen by neutral observers from other species. The trials were held publicly and broadcast across multiple star systems, and the evidence presented was damning, because human intelligence had recovered recordings and documents that proved the deliberate nature of the crimes and the callous disregard for sentient life. Kralith showed no remorse during his trial, and argued that he had been following cultural norms, and that the Vazirith had every right to treat inferior species as they saw fit. But the judges rejected this defense and found him guilty of crimes against sentient beings. General Nathan Cross stood in the command center deep beneath the surface of Mars and watched as status reports flooded in from across human space, and every indicator showed green as ships and personnel moved into position for what would either save humanity or doom it to a war they might not survive, but doing nothing was no longer an option. After what the Vazirith had done, Secretary Claire Bennett had given the final authorization from Earth after consulting with every major government, and the decision had been unanimous in a way that human politics rarely achieved, because sometimes a threat was so clear and present that all the usual arguments and disagreements fell away, leaving only the need to act. Dr. Peter Yang worked frantically in his laboratory, completing the final checks on weapon systems that had been theoretical until 6 months ago, when the first reports of hostile aliens had prompted Earth's governments to accelerate military research and development beyond anything previously attempted. Because humanity had always known that the universe might not be friendly. Captain Kevin Lynch commanded the USS Shadow, which was a ship that did not officially exist in any registry, and had spent the past 3 weeks gathering intelligence on Vazirith military installations and fleet positions, while remaining completely invisible to their sensors through stealth technology that represented humanity's most advanced achievements. The 48-hour deadline approached, and the Vazirith waited for humanity's response with confident expectation that the inferior species would submit to their demands, and Supreme Prelate Vorath had already prepared a speech about the proper order of civilizations and how the weak must serve the strong. Julie Morrison sat in her ready room aboard the Horizon and reviewed the operational plans one final time, knowing that in a few hours she would give orders that would result in death and destruction on a scale that humanity had not seen since the worst days of Earth's own wars, and she wondered if future generations would judge her actions as necessary or monstrous. Commander Foster entered without knocking because formality seemed pointless now, and he sat across from Julie and admitted that he was afraid not of dying but of what humanity was about to become, because once they crossed this line there would be no going back to being simple explorers seeking knowledge and friendship among the stars. Julie understood his fear because she shared it, but she also knew that the Vazirith had given them no choice by murdering innocents and threatening to murder more, and sometimes the only way to prevent greater evil was to commit lesser evil and hope that history would understand. The 47-hour mark passed, and Vazirith sensors detected something strange, which was that all human ships had disappeared from their tracking systems as if they had simply vanished into thin air. And this caused some concern among Vazirith military commanders who wondered if the humans had developed some kind of cloaking technology. Krelith dismissed these concerns by explaining that the humans had obviously fled in terror, and their sensor ghosts were simply residual signatures from their hasty retreat. And he ordered his forces to stand down from high alert, because the crisis was over, and humanity had been properly educated about their place in the galactic order. At the 48-hour mark, exactly something happened that would be remembered in Vazirith history as the moment their civilization learned the true meaning of terror, because 30 human warships decloaked simultaneously across 12 different Vazirith star systems, appearing from nowhere like ghosts materializing into solid reality. These were not exploration vessels or science ships, but purpose-built engines of war that had been constructed in secret facilities around Earth and Mars and Jupiter over the past 30 years, as humanity prepared for the possibility that the galaxy might be hostile, and now those preparations were being put to use. The ships were massive and bristling with weapons that represented human ingenuity and determination and desperation, combined into technology that could crack planets and shatter moons, and they moved with coordinated precision that spoke of months of planning and simulation and preparation for this exact moment. Admiral Helen Porter commanded the first strike fleet from the bridge of the UES Valiant, which was the largest warship humanity had ever built, and she gave the order to commence operations with a calm voice that belied the thunder of violence. She was unleashing as 30 ships began their systematic destruction of Vazirith military capability. The attack was surgical in its precision, as human weapons targeted only military installations and warships while avoiding civilian centers, because humanity had not lost its conscience even in war, and every target had been carefully selected to cripple Vazirith military power without unnecessary loss of life. Vazirith defensive systems tried to respond, but found themselves unable to target the human ships effectively, because the technology gap that Krelith had boasted about was not as large as he believed, and in some areas humanity had actually leaped ahead through decades of focused research and innovation, driven by the fear of being alone in a hostile universe. Within the first hour, 6 Vazirith fleets had been reduced to debris, and 18 military stations had been destroyed or disabled, and the Vazirith command structure was in chaos as they tried to understand how the weak humans had suddenly become an overwhelming threat. Colonel Stephen Grant led a special operations team aboard a stealth shuttle that approached the station where the human hostages were being held, and his team moved through the corridors with the smooth efficiency of people who had trained for years for exactly this type of mission, and the Vazirith guards never knew what hit them. The hostages were found in cells that were designed more for humiliation than security, and Grant's team had them secured and moving toward extraction points within 20 minutes of breaching the station, and the whole operation was completed. Before the Vazirith command even realized an assault was underway, Martin Cruz was a civilian engineer who had been among the hostages, and he would later describe the rescue as surreal because one moment he was locked in a cell expecting to die, and the next moment human soldiers were cutting through the door and telling everyone to move quickly and quietly, and the soldiers had a look in their eyes that said they would kill anyone who tried to stop the extraction. Teacher Amy Watson held the hand of a younger researcher who was shaking with fear and relief as they were led through corridors where Vazirith bodies lay in pools of blood, and she felt no sympathy for them because these were the same guards who had laughed while their prisoners suffered, and sometimes justice was violent and quick. The extraction was completed without a single human casualty, as all 124 hostages were loaded onto shuttles and moved to waiting ships that jumped to faster-than-light travel before the Vazirith could organize any kind of response. Warlord Kethis was the supreme military commander of the Vazirith Collective, and he watched in growing horror as report after report came in showing the destruction of forces he had believed were invincible, and he tried to rally his remaining ships for a counterattack, but found that human electronic warfare had crippled Vazirith communications across entire star systems. The humans did not communicate with their enemy, and did not send demands or threats or ultimatums, but simply continued their methodical destruction of military targets with a cold efficiency that was more terrifying than any amount of rage or hatred, because it showed that humanity had planned for this and prepared for this and would not stop until the job was complete. Kethis sent desperate messages to Supreme Prelate Vorath explaining that they needed to negotiate immediately, because the humans were not the weak species they had believed, but a powerful military force that had been hiding its true capabilities and waiting for the right moment to strike. Vorath refused to believe the reports at first because his entire worldview was built on Vazirith supremacy, and the idea that these primitive humans could threaten his empire was impossible to accept, but the evidence kept mounting as more fleets were destroyed and more stations fell silent. The Vazirith attempted to send diplomatic communications to the human forces, but received no response because humanity had chosen silence as its message, and that silence spoke louder than any words could have, as it demonstrated that the time for talking was over, and now was the time for action. Julie Morrison watched from the bridge of the horizon as human ships systematically dismantled the military infrastructure that the Vazirith had built over 3,000 years, and she felt no satisfaction in the destruction, only a grim determination to see it through, because the Vazirith had to understand that humanity would not tolerate the murder of innocents. Dr. Lisa Monroe analyzed the battle data and marveled at how effectively the human weapons were performing against Vazirith technology, and she realized that humanity's late arrival to the galactic stage might have been an advantage because they had developed their technology independently, without being constrained by the assumptions and limitations that older civilizations had built into their systems. The 6th hour of Operation Silent Thunder marked the moment when Vazirith military capability had been reduced by 60%, and their command structure was in complete disarray, and human forces had not suffered a single casualty because the element of surprise combined with. 3 days passed before Earth Command responded to Julie's report, and the answer came through encrypted channels directly from Vice Admiral Patricia Wells, who commanded the Frontier Initiative from Mars Station Alpha, and her orders were clear, though frustrating because humanity would continue diplomatic efforts regardless of Vazirith hostility, because starting an interstellar war over wounded pride was not acceptable when so much was at stake. Julie read the orders to her senior staff and watched their reactions range from understanding to barely concealed anger, because everyone aboard the Horizon had felt the sting of Kralith's insults. But orders were orders, and they would follow them even if it meant swallowing their pride and trying again to reach out to aliens who seemed determined to view them as inferior. The USS Venture arrived 2 days later under the command of Captain Gregory Shaw, who had been Julie's classmate at the Academy 20 years ago, and they greeted each other with the easy familiarity of old friends, even as they discussed the difficult situation, and Gregory admitted that his orders were the same as hers, which was to avoid conflict at almost any cost. The Vazirith seemed content to ignore the human ships for nearly a week, as if they had already dismissed humanity as irrelevant, And this silence was almost worse than the insults, because it suggested that the aliens did not even consider them worth the effort of further communication. Then everything changed when 3 human research stations and nearby systems went dark within hours of each other. And frantic investigation revealed that Vazirith ships had appeared at each location and taken the civilian scientists and support staff as prisoners, totaling 147 people, whose only crime had been studying stars and planets that the Vazirith claimed as their territory. Julie received the news with a cold feeling in her stomach, because this was no longer about hurt feelings or diplomatic posturing, but about human lives in the hands of aliens who had already demonstrated their contempt for her species. And she immediately requested permission to mount a rescue operation, but Earth Command denied her request. The orders from Vice Admiral Wells were painfully clear, as she explained through video transmission, that launching a military operation would be exactly what the Vazirith wanted, because it would give them justification to escalate and potentially threaten Earth itself, and humanity could not risk open war when they did not know the full extent of Vazirith military capabilities. Instead, the orders were to negotiate for the hostages' release and offer territorial concessions if necessary, because lives were more important than pride or even justice. And Julie understood the logic, even as it made her want to scream in frustration, because she was being ordered to bargain with people who had committed an act of war. The negotiations began poorly and got worse as Krelith appeared on the view screen with an expression that could only be described as smug satisfaction, and he informed Julie that the human prisoners were being held in comfortable conditions and would be released once humanity agreed to certain reasonable demands. The demands were anything but reasonable, as they included complete withdrawal from 20 star systems that humanity had been exploring for years, and formal acknowledgement of Vazirith supremacy in all matters concerning this region of space, and payment of what Krelith called tribute, but what everyone else recognized as extortion. Julie negotiated as best she could while following her orders to avoid conflict, and she offered compromises on territorial boundaries, and suggested establishing neutral zones where both species could operate, and even agreed to some level of formal recognition of Vazirith authority in their core systems, but none of it was enough. Supreme Prelate Vorith made his first appearance during the 3rd week of negotiations, and he was clearly the leader of the Vazirith collective, with scales that were darker and more ornate than Krelith's, and eyes that held a cruel intelligence that made Julie's skin crawl as he spoke about humanity, with the same tone one might use to discuss insects. Vorath's broadcast was transmitted across all Vazirith space, and intercepted by human ships where translators worked frantically to understand his words, and what they heard made them realize how deep the contempt truly ran, because the prelate declared that humanity was unworthy of spacefaring status and existed only at Vazirith sufferance, and should be grateful that the collective had not simply eliminated them as pests. The hostages managed to send encrypted messages through gaps in their security, and what they reported was horrifying, because the Vazirith were not simply holding them prisoner, but subjecting them to psychological torture and public humiliation, as entertainment for their captors who seemed to find human fear and distress amusing. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Blake commanded the Marine detachment aboard the Horizon, and he came to Julie's quarters late one night with plans for a rescue operation that he had been developing with his team, and the plans were good and well thought out. But Julie had to refuse because her orders from Earth Command had not changed. Ryan argued with passion about duty and honor and protecting fellow humans, but Julie reminded him that she had her orders and that disobeying them would not save the hostages, but would instead give the Vazirith exactly what they wanted, which was an excuse to paint humanity as the aggressor and potentially target Earth itself with their superior technology. The breaking point came on day 23 of the hostage crisis, when the Vazirith made their position brutally clear by executing 23 of the prisoners and broadcasting the recordings as what they called a lesson in hierarchy and proper respect for superior civilizations. Julie watched the footage because she felt she owed it to those people to witness what had been done to them, and she saw civilians who had been scientists and engineers and ordinary people trying to expand human knowledge die for no reason other than alien arrogance and cruelty. The outcry on Earth was immediate and overwhelming as billions of people saw the same footage and demanded action, and governments that had been preaching caution suddenly faced populations who wanted justice and protection and revenge against the monsters who had murdered innocent humans. Commander Foster found Julie in her quarters that night, and he did not say anything because words seemed inadequate in the face of such senseless violence, and they simply sat together in silence, while beyond the hull of the horizon, the stars continued their eternal dance uncaring of human tragedy. Earth Command sent new orders within 48 hours, and these orders included authorization for military action if necessary, but still emphasized the importance of attempting one final diplomatic solution, and Vice Admiral Wells looked tired and old in her transmission as she explained that humanity was preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. The final meeting was arranged aboard a Vazirith station at their insistence, and Julie knew it was a power play to make her come to them, but she agreed because the lives of the remaining 124 hostages were worth swallowing her pride one more time. Kralith greeted her with that same smug expression and presented the Vazirith's final ultimatum, which was that humanity would pay tribute in resources and technology and acknowledge permanent Vazirith supremacy and restrict all future expansion to areas that the collective approved, or all remaining hostages would be executed within 72 hours. Julie listened to every word and then delivered the response that Earth Command had carefully crafted, which was simple and direct, as she stated that humanity requested 48 hours to consider the Vazirith terms and would deliver their final answer at the end of that period. Kralith laughed at this and shared his amusement with the other Vazirith present, as he declared that the humans were finally learning their place and showing proper fear and submission, and he agreed to the delay because watching the humans squirm for another 2 days would be entertaining. Julie returned to the horizon and sealed herself in her ready room and sent a single encoded message to Earth Command that consisted of only 4 words, but those words changed everything because they were the code phrase that had been established for exactly this scenario. The phrase was Operation Silent Thunder, and it meant that diplomacy had failed and humanity was going to war. Every human ship in Vazirith space received similar orders within the hour, and they all began moving to predetermined positions while sending false telemetry to suggest they were preparing to leave the region in defeat, and the Vazirith monitoring them saw exactly what they expected to see, which was cowardly humans running away. All diplomatic channels went dark as humanity stopped talking and stopped negotiating and stopped explaining itself, and the silence was sudden and complete, as if someone had flipped a switch and turned off every human voice in the galaxy. Then Vazirith celebrated what they believed was final proof of human weakness, and Kralith reported to Supreme Prelate Vorath that the inferior species had been properly cowed and would likely accept all demands rather than face further consequences. On Earth and Mars and in every human colony across dozens of star systems, something was happening that the Vazirith could not see, because General Nathan Cross had activated protocols that had been in preparation for decades just in case humanity ever faced an existential threat in space, and those protocols were now in motion. The stars stretched endlessly before the USS Horizon as it drifted through the darkness of space in the year 2347, and Captain Julie Morrison stood on the bridge watching the view screen with calm eyes that had seen many wonders in her 15 years of deep space exploration, but nothing quite like what lay ahead now in the Kepler 442 system, where her crew had detected something that should not exist this far from any known civilization. Lieutenant Daniel Price turned from his console with excitement, barely contained in his voice as he reported that the structure orbiting the gas giant was definitely artificial and broadcasting signals in patterns that suggested intelligence, and possibly an invitation to communicate, and Julie felt her heart quicken, because this was what humanity had been searching for since they first left Earth's solar system 3 decades ago. Commander Alan Foster stood beside her with his arms crossed and his expression cautious, because he had been a military strategist before joining the Frontier Initiative, and he knew that first contact could go wrong in 1,000 different ways. But Julie believed in the power of patience and diplomacy, because that was how humanity had survived its own conflicts and learned to work together as one species reaching for the stars. Dr. Lisa Monroe was practically vibrating with excitement in her seat as she analyzed the readings from the alien structure and reported that the materials were unlike anything in human databases, and the energy signatures suggested technology at least 2 centuries ahead of Earth's current capabilities. And this made Julie both hopeful and wary, because advanced civilizations could be either generous teachers or dangerous threats. The horizon moved closer to the massive station that hung in orbit like a jewel of silver and green metals that seemed to shift colors in the light of the distant sun, and Julie ordered all weapon systems to remain offline and all shields at minimum power because she wanted to show these aliens that humanity came in peace and with open hands rather than closed fists. The alien response came suddenly as 3 ships emerged from behind the station, and they were sleek vessels that looked like they had been grown rather than built, with organic curves and sharp edges that suggested both beauty and menace, and they moved with a grace that made the horizon seem clumsy by comparison as they surrounded the human ship in a loose formation. Daniel worked frantically at his console trying to establish communication protocols, and after several minutes of sending mathematical sequences and basic images, he finally received a response, and the view screen flickered to life showing a being that made several crew members gasp in surprise because the alien was clearly reptilian, with scales that shimmered in shades of deep green and gold, and eyes that were vertical slits of amber that seemed to look through rather than at the humans. Before it, the alien spoke and the computer translated its words with a slight delay that made the conversation feel stilted and unnatural, but the meaning was clear enough as the being identified itself as Ambassador Kralith of the Vazirith Collective and informed them that they had entered Vazirith territory without permission and must explain themselves immediately or face consequences. Julie stepped forward and introduced herself with all the dignity and respect that humanity had practiced for such moments, and explained that the Horizon was an exploration vessel from Earth, and that they had no knowledge of Vazirith territorial claims and meant no disrespect or harm, and wished only to establish peaceful relations between their species. Kralith's response was not what anyone had hoped for as he sneered at Julie's words, and called humanity primitives who barely deserved the title of spacefaring civilization, and stated that the Vazirith Collective had ruled this sector of space for 3,000 years and had dealt with countless species who thought themselves worthy of respect, but proved to be nothing more than animals playing with tools. The insults continued as Kralith demanded that humanity acknowledge Vazirith supremacy and abandon all claims to any systems within 50 light-years of Vazirith space and submit to their authority in all matters concerning this region of the galaxy. And Julie felt anger rising in her chest but forced it down because losing her temper would solve nothing and might endanger her crew. Commander Foster leaned close and whispered that they should leave immediately and report back to Earth Command because this situation was deteriorating rapidly. But Julie shook her head because running away at the first sign of hostility would set a terrible precedent for humanity's place among the stars, and she needed to try every diplomatic option before considering retreat. Julie responded to Kralith with careful words that acknowledged the Vazirith Collective's long presence in this region, but explained that humanity had no desire for conflict and would be happy to discuss territorial boundaries and establish protocols for peaceful coexistence, and requested time to consult with her superiors on Earth before making any commitments. Kralith laughed at this, and the sound was harsh and mocking, as he told his subordinates that the humans were cowards who needed to run home to ask permission before making decisions, and that this proved they were weak and unworthy of respect, and the Vazirith had nothing to fear from such a pathetic species. The alien ambassador terminated the communication abruptly, and his ships withdrew to the station, leaving the horizon alone in the darkness, and Julie stood in silence for a long moment before ordering her crew to move to a safe distance and prepare a full report for Earth Command. Daniel approached her quietly and asked if she thought there was any chance of peaceful relations with the Vazirith, and Julie considered the question carefully before admitting that she did not know because the aliens seemed determined to view humanity through a lens of superiority and contempt, and that made negotiation difficult but not impossible. Dr. Monroe added her thoughts by noting that many species in Earth's history had started with hostility before finding common ground, and perhaps the Vazirith simply needed time to understand that humans were not a threat, but potential allies and friends. Foster was less optimistic as he pointed out that the Vazirith had 47 star systems under their control, according to the data they had intercepted, and that kind of empire was not built through friendship and cooperation, but through conquest, and domination, and humanity needed to be prepared for the possibility that diplomacy would fail. Julie ordered the crew to begin analyzing everything they had learned about Vazirith technology and culture, while she prepared her report, And as she sat in her quarters late that night, staring at the stars beyond her window, she wondered if humanity's first contact with alien life would end in friendship or something far darker. And she thought about all the people back on Earth who were counting on her to make the right decisions. The message she sent to Earth Command was detailed and honest about both the opportunity and the danger that the Vazirith represented, and she recommended continued diplomatic efforts while also suggesting that military options be prepared as contingencies, because hope for the best but prepare for the worst had always been sound advice. As the horizon waited for Earth's response, Julie could not shake the feeling that something terrible was coming, and that the Vazirith's contempt for humanity was not just cultural misunderstanding, but a fundamental belief that might lead to conflict. And she prayed that she was wrong, because the alternative was a war that humanity might not be ready to fight against an empire that had conquered the stars while Earth was still learning to walk among them.